Hello and welcome to a rather special episode of LokadTV. As you can probably tell from our less than salubrious surroundings, we are, like many of you, working from home. But today, we're lucky enough to be joined by a couple of familiar faces in Cédric Hervet and Stefan Gstettner, who are going to discuss with me the impact of the coronavirus epidemic, and in particular what supply chain practitioners can do to navigate what will likely be a turbulent few months. So guys, thanks very much for joining me today. Johannes, if we sort of start with you, one of the big supply chain topics over the last couple of months has been PPE, and in particular the shortage of masks throughout the world. So why has this been such an issue?
It's interesting. It's an issue because obviously there has been shortage of, I would say, relatively basic and critical equipments. So the PPAs, in particular the mask, were basically produced in Asia, and obviously when as the epidemic started in Asia, they had to basically serve their own population first, which when the epidemic came to the rest of the world caused a problem because we didn't have enough, protective equipment. And it's interesting because obviously that was like, this is not, I would say, a big issue in the sense of, as traveling to Mars, there is nothing very inherently difficult with this, with actually producing more of those PPEs, but just people realize that it's actually very difficult to scale up rapidly supply chains, even supply chains of fairly basic equipments, such as just regular masks. I'm not talking about the N95 or FFP2 that are more difficult to produce, but even basic masks are actually it's difficult to ramp up those supply chain, especially since basically people started to realize how that basically production have been moving, I would say, in other places of the world for the last couple of decades. So it's very difficult to bring them back. It's slow, it's costly, and basically people observe the consequences of that.
Okay, and Stefan, thanks very much for joining us sort of live from Germany today. One of the things that coronavirus really highlighted is this kind of dependence on overseas trade, and particularly in China. So do you think that we're too reliant on that?
Yeah, there could be, I think, an initial reflex to say, yes, we are too reliant. But I would say this is a bit of a too simplistic answer, because only, in quotation marks, because we have a problem in this very specific situation does not necessarily mean everything is wrong. So I would not be on the side to say, yes, we are all too reliant on China, let's cut all relationships. It needs a more differentiated view in my eyes. First of all, China is not only a sourcing market, it's also a customer market, one of the biggest for many industries. So there are dependencies which are natural to China. That's the first one. And the second one is the set of criteria to make business with China is or was defined pre-corona in a certain sense. And now, obviously, with corona, the weighting of the criteria has changed. So there will be a natural re-evaluation, let's say, moving a bit further away from pure cost focus and maybe over indexing agility, resilience objectives, let's say, and then the decisions might turn out to be different. And I'm very sure for many industries it will turn out to be different. But I wouldn't say there's a general statement allowed to say we are too dependent from China.
Yeah. And Cédric, you're just sort of down the road here in Paris as well, so it's a shame we couldn't meet in person. But one of the things we've really kind of observed throughout this time of confinement is that businesses have had to adapt, and obviously a lot of people are working from home. But organizationally, what have you kind of observed in the way that businesses are changing in order to react to this kind of situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're not totally equal in that regard because, like many other technology companies at Cardinal, it was quite easy for us to move from, normal workplace kind of work to remote working, to fully remote working. So, yeah, that was quite easy for us. We were used to use the digital tools of nowadays, and so switching was quite easy. But when you come to think about companies such as logistics companies, especially last mile companies, For them, the digitalization is not something easy to achieve. Most of the time, they are still relying on nuts and bolt stuff to really operate their activity. And for them, it's much more difficult. And in addition, for them, it's not like us. I mean, they need to have people on the field interacting with each other, giving parcels from one hand to another to truly fill the trucks to finally depart on the road, interact with other people and everything. So for them, the containment measures means a lot more than for us. And I think technologies are really the key for helping them achieving that transition better. And what we've seen is that the one who succeeded in at least not transitioning too bad was the ones who were already invested in this digital culture and new technologies.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're certainly very lucky in the fact that we can work from home, and with technology, we're able to kind of work almost as normal. Johannes, there's been kind of a lot of criticism going around with the way that certain companies have responded to these challenges and the way that they didn't have the goods stockpiled, set aside for occurrences like this and big emergency scenarios. So should companies have stockpiled more? And perhaps if not, what would have been a better approach to kind of take?
So it's interesting. What I observe is that in terms of companies were maybe criticized for example, having PPEs, but they had them, so they had been more careful about their own planning, and thus they had stockpile of things that they were deemed essential. And basically, we started to kind of blame companies for actually planning carefully against uncertain future, which is, I think, the very wrong way to look at the problem. If you have a company that had internal stockpile of essential equipment, good for them. It means that they were smart and they did the right thing ahead of time. And so I think we should not confuse the fact that those companies didn't acquire those equipment, those good. I would say uh, putting other actors at risk. I mean, they did it at a time where basically there was like no specific tension on the market. So that would be first part of the answer. Second part is it's interesting when you see that as I really follow about the answer of Stefan about we can't just break relationship with a major trade partner just because it looks as if we are too dependent on them. The reality has a super high level of details. There are many there are many things that we just don't produce in Europe, including some materials. Sometimes some materials are mined just in China, not in Europe. So it's very hard to say we are going to move certain type of operation back in Europe or in the US, just for pure physical reasons. But also, I would say it's interesting in terms of to see that for me, the bottleneck has not been the tech. I mean, for this crisis, in terms of addressing the crisis, most of the bottlenecks were just regulatory, with tons of problems that were sometimes very very mundane problems, but where it was very difficult for companies to react in ways that were even sometimes sensible, just because there was a lot of artificial barriers in place. I mean, just an anecdotal evidence. Aircraft around the world, especially in France, but it's not the only country, have been flying with their seats on to carry aircraft cargo. So basically, there has been like a massive spike in demand for aircraft cargo. And it's so in this sort of situation, and because there is no more passengers, flying around, the very obvious thing to do is just to remove the seats from the aircraft, just to have the aircraft that flies, over with better capacity and consume less fuel and make a better equipment of the aircraft that you have. But across the world, some countries, including France, have decided that at this point of time, it's still in effect that aircraft didn't have I would say civilian aircraft didn't have the right to just remove the seats to carry cargo. So I see a lot of super accidental bottlenecks in supply chains where yes, technology is a big enabler, but it's the interesting thing with this crisis, I believe, is that tech's worked quite well. I mean, companies like Zoom or Microsoft with Microsoft Teams have been able to absorb incredible spikes of consumption. I mean, they have been able to basically nearly overnight multiply their capacity by a factor 20, which is kind of insane when you think about it. In contrast, so the bottlenecks were really not tech, which worked pretty well. But in contrast, if you look at other areas, they have been facing like very, very dumb bottlenecks in all sorts of areas, and most of them were regulatory rather than being like physical limits.
Okay, if we kind of take that example then of maybe tech wasn't a bottleneck, where perhaps there might be other bottlenecks, might be maybe communication. One of the things we've kind of seen is there's been poor visibility for governments to know exactly how many masks they can actually get from overseas. So Stefan, would you say that there's been poor visibility of supply chains, and how can we improve that visibility in the future?
I think visibility is one of the historic challenges in supply chains. So, which I think surprises all of us, which we are experts in supply chain management, why it is so difficult to achieve good end-to-end visibility. But the reality is, it has not been fully achieved by many companies, and it's also not 100% easy on the granularity level that you need. So, yes. Visibility is, of course, important, and it would have been desirable to have much higher visibility. On the other hand, I think it's not enough to have this visibility, because the problem is with having much more granular visibility that you suddenly are confronted with so many data, and it's not always as clear where to look at. I mean, masks is a good example, but our economy is more complex than producing and shipping masks. So we are talking about billions and billions of combinations that need to be looked at. And therefore, it needs a high quality impact analysis based on those visibility. And that is then becoming even more difficult to understand. Where should I look at? Where is the highest impact of a disruption in my supply chain? So that is sort of the second step. And then I think the third step is the anticipation part of the story, because pure visibility in real time is looking at the presence, but obviously we are very much interested now into the short-term future and to prepare for some developments. Is it easy to forecast that at the moment? Of course not. It's not at all easy. We had, for example, a good discussion with our retail clients. Should they turn off their auto-replenishment algorithms in the stores because they are based on store-based forecasting? And that is relying on historical demand sometimes also on forward-looking factors. And the history obviously is not at all a good predictor for the future in current times. So the question, how do we excel in our capabilities to predict the future in such volatile times, is important. On the other hand, unfortunately, it's also not easy to solve. But those three elements, I think, visibility, impact analysis, and then predictability, if that comes together for the next crisis, I think we are much better equipped to counteract the crisis.
Sure. And Cédric, one of the really kind of interesting things over the last couple of months is everybody's been stuck at home, so they've been incredibly reliant and incredibly dependent on sort of home delivery. And in particular, it's those last mile players who've seen huge spikes in demand and huge variation in kind of the demand they'd expect. So how has this home confinement kind of impacted upon deliveries?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's been quite a change for them in the last few weeks. You probably know that the last mile part of the supply chain is probably one of the most costly and perhaps one of the most complex to operate as well, since it's really the most complex. You've got so many things to deal with that it makes this part of the supply quite complex. So yeah, the changes are huge, especially in terms of demand. It's not only the volumes of the demand, but the nature itself of the demand that changed. Indeed, we've seen that for most companies that were actually relying on deliveries to operate, since they are shut down, the volume themselves will drop down as well. And on the contrary, you've got some home deliveries that we are all probably using right now to get food or to get stuff for ourselves. And this demand is quite increasing. And depending on how these different players were actually dealing with their deliveries, it could lead to a huge increase in terms of activity or complete shutdown. Probably know that in France, at least, Mondial Relay or Relais Colis have completely shut down their activity because they were relying on the openness of their, their partners. Once at the same time, you've got Amazon trying to employ 100,000 more people to just face the challenges of this new demand. And so this is probably the one aspect, and the nature of the demand change. It means when you have less B2B based demand to serve and more B2C, it's definitely not the same areas you will visit, definitely not the same constraints, not the same quality of service engagement you will make, and so this could change completely the way you work. And to really face that kind of challenge, you need data. You need also more than data, just like Stefan said, you need the ways to operate the data, to activate the data in the right way to take the right decision. And unfortunately, most last mile operators are poorly equipped in this kind of tools. Their data is often not they do not have a very good data quality at this stage, because it's really the end of the line, and so all the errors accumulated along the way are really having a huge impact at this stage. And so without good data, you can't do much, and even if you could have a reliable data, you can't do much with it, because you are poorly equipped in terms of artificial intelligence and stuff like that. So yeah, and if you just add on top of that all the social distancing constraints you must take into account to protect your drivers, you can't have as many people as before in the warehouse to just operate the parcels and everything. It makes everything much more complex for you. Yeah.
Okay, and let's build on that idea of data then, because what we're seeing, Johannes, is kind of the most extreme of statistical outliers. I mean, these are situations that are incredibly difficult to predict. So can technology really still help at a time like this?
I believe so. I mean, and it's surprisingly much easier than what people would expect. I think that's the beauty of those probabilistic forecasts, is that you don't need to know exactly what is going to disrupt you. It's fairly, reasonable to put something like a 1% chance for every 3-month period, every quarter, that you will suffer, whatever the reason, a massive, loss of demand, or a massive spike of demand. You see that the essence of probabilistic forecasting, which is a way to have like risk-driven, supply chain management, that Lokad has been advocating for years, is not that you know perfectly the future. We don't even try through data to forecast things that have never been observed. It's near impossible to look at the problem from this angle. But if you look at it from the other angle, you know that uncertainty exists, and there are tons of things that exist. And for example, when we say we have to focus on uncertainty on all areas, for example, and for years again, we have been advocating, for example, to forecast both demand and lead times with probabilistic forecast. And what probabilistic forecast for lead time does, it's for any reason, maybe all your shippings are going to be late, maybe a couple of months late. You don't need to know exactly why it's happening. Maybe it's a geopolitical situation. Maybe it's a tsunami that has just disrupted some harbors in Southern Asia. Maybe it's actually an epidemic. Maybe it's a terrorist attack. Maybe, whatever. There are like dozens of scenarios. All of them are fairly improbable. But if you think it in aggregate, it I would say every couple of years it happens something. In 2004 there was like a tsunami, a massive tsunami in Asia. There has been in 2001 there has been like the World Trade Center was attacked. So every couple of years there is massive disruption that can be very random for completely diverse reasons. California is at risk of having one day a massive earthquake that would basically probably completely disrupt all the West Coast in terms of supply chain in the US. So there are plenty of reasons, and the idea with probabilistic forecasting is that you don't need to know the fine print to basically inject risk in your modelization. You can just say, I know that's almost a belief that there is some inherent degree of risk. I inject that into my model, and so all the decisions that I take are optimized against a certain level of risk. But even doing that, I go back to Stefan. The reality has a high level of I would say of high level of finesse, high degree of details. And so, for example, for mask, even something as basic as mask, right now, my own diagnosis of the situation is that the bottleneck is not even the production of mask anymore. It's filtration test. Actually, in Europe and in the US, all the facilities that can do filtration tests on mask, so assess whether the quality of the mask that you've just produced, especially for N95, FFP2 in Europe, N95 in the US, FFP2 in Europe, you need to assess that the quality and the performance of the mask. And it turned out that the facilities that can do that are few and far between, and they are completely overwhelmed just testing Chinese imports right now. So you can end up with, I would say, surprising bottlenecks that were nowhere in your in your visibility spectrum for your supply chain. You can even discover new bottlenecks. So indeed it's quite difficult in practice.
Stefan, I'd be very interested to kind of hear kind of what you do at BCG. Johannes mentioned there was a few examples of these rare scenarios that occur, like the tsunami, like 9/11, where there's a real shock to a whole entire supply chain. So how do you prepare kind of your clients for these types of scenarios?
So actually, we are encouraging our clients to think through those events, and I very much like what Johannes just said, that they are very unlikely, but the probability is not 0%. Huh? So therefore, doing a bit of those wargaming approach with their current supply chain setup, that is something that we frequently do with our clients or encourage our clients to do. And I think maybe a topic like single sourcing is a good example of that. Of course, there is a very, let's say, naive rationale to do single sourcing because you put all your volume on one supplier. Then if you are lucky and find a supplier in Cambodia who is really cheap, then commercially single-minded, let's say, that might be a good deal. But obviously, with respect to other criteria, it might not be a good deal. And this wargaming or scenario evaluation against rare but high impact scenarios, that is important. Huh? So it's sometimes a bit cumbersome to do that because the immediate value impact. So do I have an ROI of these kinds of efforts in half a year or something like this? That doesn't apply. But I think times like this, like the COVID crisis, show us that it's inevitable to go down this path to simulate those seldom events.
And I would add that it's a matter of survival for the companies. So if you don't do that, it's not a matter of ROI, because if you if you just go bankrupt because you've absolutely disregarded a class of risk, if you stop being in business, it doesn't matter that you had ROI or whatever. It's you can't recover from basically from bankruptcy. I mean, most of the time. But so that's why it's very interesting, because you can have many. I would say that's the thing with tail risk, is that sometimes the risk, although it's very improbable, the economic penalty for misapprehending the risk can be actually bigger than all the profit that you've ever brought. People are now starting to realize that. There have been some very public situations, some very public cases with drugs that had negative effects, where basically you end up with a net negative effect that was like gigantic compared to the intended benefits. So it did happen once or twice, probably a bit more in the history of, I would say, of pharma. It did happen a little bit in the history of aviation with some aircraft that were deemed very unsafe. The 737 Max is just one example, but actually, if you look back in history, there has been some other crisis decades earlier that actually terminated some companies in this area. So it's I think that's very important to also think the long game, and I believe that here a company that has been exceedingly good at that is Amazon. They have been really playing. I mean, Jeff Bezos has really been playing the long game on basically ramping up his infrastructure literally decades ahead, so that when sort of crisis situation happen, I mean, this is not magical. They didn't do everything perfect, but their long-term investment, while basically every single company is going down almost in this period, companies that have been like preparing decades ahead, like Amazon, are actually gaining a lot of market share, which is very, very impressive.
Okay, let's kind of look at that in a bit more detail then. Cédric, Johannes mentioned Amazon there, and we're also seeing companies like Zoom and Netflix doing incredibly well out of this period of time and this period of difficulty. So are there any positive effects we can focus on, and who are the companies that have done particularly well?
Positive effects, yeah, definitely. There have been some winners in this game. We should not lose the sight on the fact that most companies will be losers in the times to come, because obviously the economic impact will be so huge that most companies will won't perform well in the coming months. But of course, there are some winners, and they probably succeeded, like Johannes and Stefan just said, by anticipating this long tail risk, and in order to protect themselves against that risk. I think, I mean, if there has to be a positive outcome of this crisis, apart from the whole health crisis consideration, which could never be a positive one, but from the supply chain perspective, I think it could be positive if in the end it acts as a revealer, as an eye opener on the many weaknesses of the supply chain, and to be more precise, on the supply chain practices, because actually Stefan gave a very good example. When you're trying to really focus on your commercial deals, trying to cut down the cost in order to really have the best ROI possible, I mean, you're inherently fragilizing your supply. You're adding weakness points all along the way, and in the end, in terms of crisis like this, it just won't make it. So yeah, maybe it will make supply chain deciders switch their mind from a pure ROI-oriented perspective to a more resilience and agility-focused perspective on the supply chain, which is demanding maybe more efforts, but it does not mean as well that it's opposite to the search for cost reduction, because being more resilient and agile on the long run, it also yields very good cost reductions as well.
And Johannes, obviously, hopefully, we'll get to the end of this in some time in the near future. Can you see us heading towards some sort of normality, or are there any long-lasting consequences that you really believe will change the way we kind of operate for evermore?
Yeah, I mean, I think history has told, if you look at history, you would see that basically things go back to normal even after, incredibly traumatic events. So I've like 100% confidence, near 100% confident that things will go back to normal. Humanity, if you look, you know, even 1 century backward, managed to go back to humanity, to normalcy, even after incredibly traumatic events like wars and everything. So it's a matter of time. It might take, I don't know if it will take months or a few years. That I don't know, but definitely yes, normalcy, a certain degree of normalcy will be coming back. But what worries me is that probably the wrong lessons will be remembered, you know. So obviously for me, but I'm looking at the problem from I would say a very specific angle. It's just what we discussed in one of our previous videos, like for example, safety stocks are unsafe. You know, that's one of the previous episodes that we did. There are class of supply chain practices that are, you know, unsafe by design, even if the way they are named make it look they are safe. They are not. So that's very funny. I hope, that's just a hope, that this sort that I would say more supply chain practitioners will realize, you know, that basically certain practices like safety stocks or service level just do a very poor job at delivering what was the original intent. But that's just a hope. I'm not sure at all that it will actually act this way. The other thing is where I believe that we can end up with all the wrong lessons is that for example, the idea of makes production go home might end up missing completely the point of why things were moved away. And from a supply chain perspective, it's completely obvious that it's easier to produce, you know, if you have the option to just produce locally, to consume locally, everything is simpler and cheaper. So when people don't do that, and decide to have actually the production 10,000 kilometers away from where it's actually consumed, usually there are very, very good reasons. And so I hope, but again, it's a hope, I think that it will be the wrong lessons. I hope that maybe in general, supply chain practitioners and maybe their governments will actually start wondering why many of those predictions went away. And that will be a very interesting question, because that's answering those questions is probably something much more reliable to prepare the world against the next crisis, as opposed to, let's say, establish super strong tariff to make sure that there is much less trading with other countries.
Okay. Stefan, did you want to kind of dive in there? I mean, do you think we'll head towards some sort of normality, or can you see some very much long-lasting consequences?
Yeah. No, actually, I wanted to build on what Johannes just said. I think the trigger, the current crisis, can be a good trigger to sort out some of the famous buzzwords that we see in the supply chain and really ask what are the underlying capabilities in the mid and long term that supply chains need to continue to develop in order to be better equipped for the next crisis. And let me try a little round shortly. The first buzzword obviously is control tower. We touched upon it, which can provide good end-to-end visibility, I guess. So control tower, I think, is not a tool or a solution. It's a capability to have good visibility in the supply chain. That's the first one. Then the second buzzword is digital twin. We very often see it. What capability does it provide? It provides a capability to navigate in the next, let's say, 12 weeks to do some sort of short-term scenario play, probabilistic simulation and all that, to be much more flexible and agile to react to shorter-term developments. Third one is AI-based or whatever-based scenario play in the integrated business planning. I think that's a capability that is then equipping companies to play through the next 18 months in their IBP cycle. So then they are preparing for longer term pickup after the crisis. And with that, the time horizon from now to 18 months in the future would be covered by world-class capabilities, not by buzzwords and not by technology only, but really by capabilities. And the fourth one is let's say, the agile way of working and the cross-functional teams, which are also critical to have in order to accelerate decision cycles and to use all those planning concepts in order to make quick and high quality decisions to come out of this crisis. And I think it will be a trigger in our future discussions with supply chain leaders whether those capabilities should be accelerated to be developed in many companies.
Okay. Cédric and Johannes will start wrapping it up, and so I'll ask probably the same question to you guys. The IMF is saying that the world economy is shrinking at the fastest rate for decades. So how do you believe companies should prepare for this?
As I said before, I think these companies should really try to work right now on, acquiring visibility on what's happening inside them. But just like Stefan said, acquiring some strong and real capabilities to operate the data they will collect in the right way to serve multiple objectives, not only the ROI. For example, when you think about the last mile deliveries today, they are quite, they didn't have the weapon to face the what's happening to them, and with the right combination of data optimization, machine learning tools, you can combine that to really provide short-term simulation on and trying new ways to organize themselves. You can simulate them in advance, and once you've decided yourself about one kind of organization you want to implement, these tools can operate this new organization for you. They can help they can assist your operators in that regard, and ultimately these kind of tools can also make your organization more robust and agile by switching from the very static way of organizing your deliveries to something much more dynamic, when you're capable of recomputing things every day to really cope with the challenge of the day instead of an averaged, somehow inaccurate challenge that is only valuable when you look at it on the at the scope of a quarter or semester. So yeah, there is really something to do there, and I think preparing for the next era is just trying to find the best way to come out of the crisis with something stronger and more resilient, and obviously getting prepared for the next crisis, because there will be a next crisis. We just don't know what will be the cause and when it will happen, but it will happen for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and Johannes, we'll leave kind of the last word to you. It's obviously going to be a turbulent few months ahead of us. So what's your advice to a company to best prepare for that?
My belief is that the only way to be ready, just like Amazon was, for this sort of crisis events, was to have like a decade of preparation. And the problem is, if you don't have a decade of preparation, well, you should start now. And if you could not start 10 years ago, then the best day to start is still now. And I think the mistake would be to say, oh, because we are facing a very terrible, I would say, an economic situation that is terrible, then basically we start cutting all the things, in terms of costs that would actually make us potentially more ready for the next problem. I mean, this has to start now, and sometimes it's very, very mundane things. I mean, people can completely, I would say, overestimate what it looks like. For example, in France, I've noticed that no, maybe not most, but many e-commerce websites from major companies could not handle the load. And I'm not talking of some things that is like super difficult to scale, like let's say a web search engine like Google, or like video traffic, like what Zoom is doing right now for us. It's in terms of IT, scaling, a website, even if it's like an e-commerce shopping cart, is completely trivial. This is not something difficult. So I think there are many companies that have been postponing tons of I would say, of investment, of improvements, where they should really question whether that was smart, and if not, really start investing, massively. Good, I would say, access to funding. We can debate whether it's good or bad, but basically, I believe that in many countries, access to funding is not actually that difficult. I mean, not much more difficult than it usually is, even in this period. And so my suggestion would be invest in things that will make you more robust to the next crisis, even if it's in 10 years, even if the ROI is not obvious right now. Invest in the fundamentals. That would be, my message is, whatever your fundamentals are, invest in with I would say, a risk aware vision, as opposed to go for like immediate ROI that is very fragile to changing conditions.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there, but gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and stay safe over the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and stay safe, and we'll hopefully see you in the next episode. Bye for now.